Right. Well, thank you to Michael for suggesting I'm now redundant. It has been suggested several times in the past. It was suggested in 2000 when the Act was passed. And of course, we then learned it wasn't going to be brought into force for over 4 years. And then it was suggested when it was brought into force that we should wind ourselves up. And 18 months later, the government launched an attempt to substantially restrict the Act. And then the Maclean Bill to remove Parliament from the Act was launched. And so I'm not quite on the point of winding myself up just yet. This is the coalition agreement published today. The provisions on freedom of information are exactly the same as in the abridged provision published a few days ago. That is, there's going to be a freedom bill and an extension to the Freedom of Information Act to provide greater transparency, but it looks like an extension to the scope of the Act. It looks like that implies. The Conservatives pre-election said that one of the things they were going to do is to make the Information Commissioner subject to appointment and probably funding by Parliament and not by central government, adopting the Scottish model. Whether in practice that is of much benefit to the Information Commissioner may be an open question, particularly if Parliament feels badly scarred by the Information Commission's activities over MPs' expenses. They may be moving to a less favourable atmosphere. And they promised to extend the scope of the Act within weeks, and they suggested some of the bodies they were likely to bring within the scope of the Act within weeks. I think those last two are interesting and significant. This one is the popular one. This is the one that people will no doubt go for. Tribunals are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act except in relation to their administration anyway, so that's a slightly unusual one. And the committee, the organising committee for the Olympic Games. The Lib Dems, in their manifesto, talked about strengthening the Data Protection Act and the Office of the Commissioner and extending it to private companies delivering monopoly services. So Network Rail gets a vote from the Lib Dems and from the Conservatives. So I think the game is up for Network Rail. Labour had gone through a long consultation process about extending the Act before it left office and had announced it was going to bring ACPO within the Act. ACPO, the Association of Chief Police Officers, who volunteered themselves, I believe. UCAS, the university's scheme. Academy schools, who were fighting a bitter rearguard action against this decision, last I heard, and the Financial Ombudsman Service, who I think also accepted that it was proper that they should be covered. So I assume we'll see these added to the Conservatives' list. I must say, I think there must be other candidates. I think after the fiasco of people unable to vote, I think electoral registration officers and returning officers must be a candidate for being brought under the Act. I mean, I think the lack of accountability by those bodies is completely unacceptable, by those of officers. Water companies are not subject to the Act. The Information Commissioner previously held that they were, has now reversed his position in light of the tribunal ruling on Network Rail, and has now held that they're not. Companies which are 100% owned by a public authority are covered, but a company which is 50% owned by two local authorities or two public authorities is not covered. It's got to be 100% owned by one authority to be covered. I think that is an obvious opportunity to extend the Act. Partnership bodies and so on seem to be... private prisons were strongly hinted at in the Labour government's consultation document and dropped at a late stage from their proposals. I hope that they will be back on the agenda. Housing associations, which was administering what was traditionally local authority housing stock. NHS contractors, who are private contractors acting under providing services under the NHS. You may be able to get the information through the NHS body, but that creates problems which are would not exist if they were directly subject to the Act. So if your diagnosis is carried out by an NHS facility, you have direct access. It's carried out by a contractor, you've got to go to the contracting body to try and get the access. I think there's some scope for some of the self-regulators in the legal field, for example, and contractors more generally may well. It's an interesting test of where the coalition stands on this issue, whether they're prepared to go into the private sector as opposed to overlooked public bodies. The Liberal Democrats have talked about the Freedom Bill. Well, the Freedom Bill is in the coalition agreement, and the Liberal Democrats' version of the Freedom Bill is on the website, has been on the website for over a year. And so you can see what their view of it was. I don't know if you can read it. Yes, you may be able to read this. The one thing they're going to do is to take the prejudice test, which applies to many of the Freedom of Information Act exemptions, and change it into a substantial prejudice test, as applies under the Scottish Freedom of Information Act, and which this was originally the proposal in the white paper, Your Right to Know Here. Derry Irvine and David Clarke's proposal was substantial harm. It was dropped after the thing was taken away from David Clarke and moved to the Home Office. The second thing they were proposing to do was to abolish the ministerial veto. Now, I think that would be a very fundamental change to the structure of the Act. I mean, the government has used the veto twice for Cabinet and Cabinet Committee papers. Before the election, it was on the point of creating a new exemption for Cabinet papers generally, not just minutes, but papers circulated to Cabinet. Fortunately, and I think this is Gordon Brown's personal intervention, they retreated from that. I think that would have knocked a large hole in the Act. And so we'll have to see whether that remains on the agenda as far as the Liberal Democrats and the new coalition go. They're also proposing to remove the restriction on appeal from the tribunal to the higher court, so that the appeal was not on a point of law but on the merits of the case. Personally, I'm not very keen on that. I think limiting it to a point of law is helpful, because if you allow full appeal on the merits, you find every public authority resisting disclosure goes to the High Court with whatever public funds are still available to it, whereas hardly any requesters will ever be able to go there or represent or be represented at the High Court. So I'm less keen on that. The final thing they were proposing was a public interest defence to the Official Secrets Act. That would be very interesting as well. Now, that's the proposals we had sort of on the table by the coalition partners. I want to talk about what I think is the most substantial problem that we face, and that is the problem of delays in the Act. We carried out a survey about 9 months ago of Information Commissioner decision notices and how long it took from the date on which the complaint was made to the date on which the decision notice was issued, and in a quarter of cases it took between 2 and 3 years. In fact, the longest took almost 4 years from complaint being received by the Commissioner's office to the decision notice appearing. Now, I think that is kicking it into, not just kicking it into the long grass, that is kicking it into a jungle on an island, on an isolated island to which you have no access at all. I mean, that's out of the question. I think Chris Graham has done, by the sound of it, rather important work in getting rid of the worst part of the backlog. We'll have to wait and see what the latest figures are. But while there's anything like this, the Act cannot work properly.